My name is Kirk Klanke. I'm the president of the Headwaters chapter of Trout Unlimited. This is Marissa Belcaster. She's an employee here at the Headwaters Center. We're going to tag team this presentation on human impacts on the headwaters. To start talking about human impacts on the headwaters, let me back up first. If the Zoom audience has any questions, would you use the chat box to ask them? And at the end of this presentation, we'll answer those questions. In the live audience, just raise a hand and we'll do our best to answer your questions. I'm not saying we have answers, but we'll do our best. So to talk about human impacts on the headwaters, we first have to start on a section of the Fraser River where there is no human impacts. My favorite section is on Berthoud Pass, where the Fraser starts. If you get above the highway on the Second Creek Trail is an excellent place to understand what a pristine river looks like. So then once we know what pristine is, we can move our way downstream to understand what these human impacts are doing to the river. So up on Second Creek, if you park and walk up only about a quarter mile, you'll get to a section of river that is about as pristine as you're going to find here after 100 years of human impact in the Fraser Valley. This section of river, the first thing you'll notice, is so clear that you will see right through the water. It's like the water's hardly there. You'll see that rocky bottom. There's no turbidity in this river because we're above the impacts that cause turbidity. So we have nice clear water. The next thing you'll notice if you stick your hand in it is you can't leave your hand in it very long. Pristine rivers are cold. Rivers that hold trout need to be cold. Trout is a cold water species. Cold water holds oxygen. So there's more dissolved oxygen in cold water than there is warm water. And trout require more oxygen, so they can only live in cold water. So I started out mentioning how clear the water was, how you'd look down and see that rocky stream bottom. If the stream doesn't have sediment covering those rocks, if you see not only the rocks, but the different sizes of rocks, which create the interstitial spaces where the macroinvertebrates can live. A healthy, pristine river has an all rocky bottom with very little sediment, some fine sands, but a certain percentage of those is healthy for the river. I mentioned oxygen. One thing I like to tell people when we're up there at Second Creek is just stand still for a minute and listen. What you're hearing is oxygen being stirred into that water. The babbling brook, the water falling over logs and rocks, that's oxygen getting stirred in and then being held there by the temperature. This is a requirement for a pristine river is a high dissolved oxygen content. And then the last indicator of a healthy river isn't even in the river, it's on either side of the river. There are wetlands plants that grow on either side of the river that depend on the river feeding it water because these plants have larger leaves that when the sun shines on it, the water evaporates out of that plant. If it couldn't suck up more water right away, it wouldn't survive. So plants with larger leaves on either side of the river are the riparian zone. The riparian zone is so important to the river because they're the filter for the river. As sediments try and migrate into the river, these plants catch it. And that's why the rocky bottom is so clear and why these plants are so important to the river and why the river is so important to these plants. So we look for these 5 indicators. Now, we parked at the Second Creek parking lot and walked up to this section of river. We only have to get back down to our car at Second Creek to understand what the first human impact on our rivers and the headwaters are. So Marissa will discuss that one with you. Thanks.
quickly go ahead and change the slide here. So as Kirk mentioned, the first impact that us humans have on the river is traction sand. 6,000 to 9,000 tons of sand is put on the west side of Berthoud Pass each year. And over time, this sand migrates into the Fraser River. This fills the rocky bottom with all the macroinvertebrate habitat, taking away the top of the food chain, which is the trout who live on those macroinvertebrates. The sand starts off super jagged and very sharp, and as it's like driven on and tumbles down, it's these tiny little pieces that get into like all the little cracks. So in the picture behind me, you can see Kirk standing on what appears to be so much sand, and this is before a sediment basin was built. So in the second picture here, change for us. Some quick little technology problems. There we go. So the second picture here is a sediment basin that was built in 2013. After this was built, the sand content of the river went from 75% to 17%. So what happens is the water flows in here, hits this berm at a 90-degree angle, and this causes the sand to drop and the river loses velocity, and then it continues down. What you can see right here is where heavy machinery can get into all that sand, and every fall they take that sand out and move it to a county gravel pit. So it's used in our roads to reduce the percentage of clay that we find. So after that, I will let Kirk talk about transbasin diversion.
So this will be our next human impact. It happens closer to the base of Berthoud Pass at the elevation of around 10,000 feet. And this human engineering, these pipes take about 60% of the headwaters of the Colorado River and Fraser through either the Adams Tunnel in Grand Lake or the Moffett Tunnel here in the Fraser Valley. This, in the Fraser Valley, these diversion structures put a horseshoe completely around the valley. They start over at Meadow Creek Reservoir and wrap the valley in a complete horseshoe at that 10,000, 10,002 elevation, all the way over to Byers Peak. So the water comes down to a point, gets put into some really interesting engineering. Gravity flows under the divide through the Moffett Tunnel. That leaves about 40% of the native flows in the Fraser River. About 60% is diverted. What happens when there's a 40% of the native flows spread over the native stream bed is the stream will lose its velocity. That water spreads out wide and shallow. Once the stream's lost its velocity, it's much easier for sediments to deposit rather than being carried on through the system. And when you have a wide and shallow stream, it's also built like a solar collector. So now you've got the river heating up. And as we discussed earlier, when a river heats up, dissolved oxygen can easily escape into the atmosphere as the river temperatures get warmer, and the trout then have less oxygen, and it threatens their survival. Let me see. One other point I'd like to make is when you have warmer water and sediment at the same time, now you've got a perfect medium for growing weeds and algae. Weeds and algae will also put an oxygen demand on the river as they die and decay. It pulls oxygen out of the stream. So having a river with 40% is detrimental to the river, but it doesn't mean the death of a river. I'm going to change the tape, okay? Or I mean the picture. Oh, you got it? Thanks. So we know 60% of the river gets diverted to the Front Range. 60% of that diverted water isn't consumed by human beings. It's used for outdoor irrigation. 60% of the residential water goes pretty much on Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass comes from an environment that gets 38 inches of rain a year. Denver gets an average of 12. This year, probably less. So what we're doing is we're growing a non-native species that needs more water than the native environment has. So we're taking that water from the natural environment on the west slope to grow a non-native species on the front range. It causes problems in the river: temperature, sedimentation, and weed and algae problems. This year, last summer, Denver set a record for the most days over 90 degrees that they've seen since they started recording air temperature. Their water consumption was up. The only couple of incidences where it went below average was a snowstorm in September and a snowstorm in October. So that's an indicator that bluegrass is getting a priority for water use in Colorado over the natural environment, because that water was pretty much used outdoors, which was hot and dry, so they needed more. And people were willing to pay more and use more water to keep their bluegrass green. So a serious threat to our local streams is how people choose to use their water. Here's another threat that's recently there's been a lot of talk about. The people on Wall Street want to make water a commodity and move it to where it has the most value. Well, when they talk about moving water where it has the most value, they never talk about the value of the water to the environment. They talk about buying agricultural water, selling it to cities, and cashing in on the profit. The environment, the value of water in Colorado for the environment is priceless. Our tourism economy is based on our pristine environment. So for Wall Street to talk about making water a commodity is a serious threat to the river. The only way you can raise the value of water is through the trans-basin diversion, which by Colorado water law is legal. But when you take water out of the Fraser Basin to Denver, there's no return flow. The river it's 100% consumptive loss. The river doesn't see that water again until way downstream when some of the augmentation reservoirs have been built closer to partial. So we have a 40-mile hole in the Fraser River and the upper Colorado River. The only way that you can increase the value of that water is by creating holes in the river. So a serious threat that our legislature needs to pay really close attention to. Protecting agricultural water is so good for a river because a rancher in Grant County will use that water in Grant County and return that water in Grant County. The greater majority of that water gets returned to the basin it was taken from. The town of Winter Park, when they take water out of the river, they return 97%. When it gets taken to the other side of the divide, 0% return. That's when you see your temperature issues, your sediment issues. A river starts to have trouble surviving. So if we were talking solutions, I'd like to show this picture of the Fraser Flats project. Thank you very much. Uh-oh, my technicians are punching all the buttons. How's it working?
You know, not bad for a first time.
Yeah, I apologize for any technical difficulties. We've got more technicians than I've ever done a presentation with. Look how good they are. Just a quick little talk about solutions that we've done right here in the Fraser Valley. Did I get that quicker? I'm
Absolutely.
going to use the pointer too. Here in the Fraser Valley, we have 40% of the native flows flowing in a native stream bed. So what we did was take this overwide channel right here, just above Tabernash, right off of, from County Road 83 up. This overwide channel is really shallow, it really heats up, and has a hard time sustaining macroinvertebrates and trout. So we created these point bars that push the river into a narrower channel, create some sinuosity, and then we have ripples up here going into a pool here, and then more ripples there going into a pool. The pools are where the trout can hide from warmer temperatures. The riffles are where the macroinvertebrates thrive. So as this river narrows, it picks up velocity, it cleans the rocks off, it gives the macroinvertebrates a healthy place to survive. And then just below each one of those riffles, with all the bug life, are fish with their mouths open, waiting to grow fatter. We can engineer our way out of some of this, that fantastic engineering that creates a Moffett collection system. Those same engineers can help design a stream channel that'll match the stream flow. And Denver Water was one of the partners on this project. So I'll get into collaboration later, but there's more than just problems with there's more than human caused problems. There's also human solutions. And this talk is trying to highlight both of those. So the answer for the Kentucky bluegrass is obviously that native grass species need to be planted instead of bluegrass, less thirsty plants, zero scaping. Every time I go to Denver, I see more and more of it. It lightens my heart to know that the people in the Front Range understand, or a portion of them understand, that their water use impacts stream health on the West Slope, and they're doing things to change it. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the next big impact on our rivers.
Alrighty, so the elephant in the room that Kirk mentioned is climate change. And he touched on a few of these issues just before, about how the air temperature is higher than normal. Thank you. Reminder to take the mask off. The air temperatures are higher than normal, Denver having their hottest summer that they've had recorded. And with the higher elevations in Colorado, where the rivers are born, are experiencing these higher temperatures. And as the forests dry out, the pine beetles and other infestations are taking a toll on the trees that are already stressed. The dry conditions with an abundant fuel source have led to massive forest fires in the headwaters of the Colorado River. As we've all experienced this summer, it's awful. The aftermath of these fires is mudslides, ash, and burned debris ending up in the streams and rivers. Another impact comes from the chemicals used in house constructions migrating to the watershed and after the wildfire. Destruction of the riparian plants removes the filter that protects our waterways otherwise, and the migrating ash has nothing to be stopped by. So the next picture I want to bring up as well. There's a few pictures here of the destruction that the fires caused. If we can get it. There we go. Just click. So here's like a picture as well. You can see in the back there, I'll just get my laser. You can see this car burned out as well. And all those chemicals from the car eventually make their way into the river, as well as all the construction material used for the house. Oh, let me go back one. Okay. There we go. Oh. clicker's working now. Awesome. So here in this picture, we can see the Riparian Zone. This is the river flowing straight through here. It's just all icy and frozen, so it's all white. So we can see that there's no filtering happening because the riparian plants are damaged here. And the next picture, which we briefly saw, was the red slurry that is dropped on our fires. So often, like when the fire's put out, everybody's relieved because the most like threatening thing happening is now gone, but the impact from, I'm not sure what's happening, hold on. Back a bit, there we go. So the impact from the red slurry, it's filled with so many chemicals, especially ammonia and nitrates, which are fertilizers, which Kirk actually touched on just before. Like they make our way into the rivers, and things like algae and weeds start growing, and it has a bigger demand for the oxygen in the river, and especially with the warmer water temperatures, it just like grows like crazy. So that's going to bring me on to Kirk's part, talking about development. And I'll leave the clicker, it's working for you.
So that will be the next human impact to discuss, development. You can't break ground without soils migrating. These soils migrating become part of the sediment on the bottom of the river. Here's a pretty good example. With water just off the one side, all this ground that's been disturbed, when there's a storm event, will be migrating. It's really important as humans, and we do have regulations in place when they're followed, which they not always are, but we do use best management practices to keep soil from migrating. That is one solution to this issue. That hasn't always been the case in Grand County, but it is now, unfortunately. Unfortunately, my clicker doesn't work, but I can just advance it forward one slide. Unfortunately, when erosion control doesn't work, you see how brown this water is? This is coming off of development in Grand County, in the Fraser Valley, and it's flowing into the Fraser River, which is clean, but this isn't. This is unacceptable. That sediment like that could get into a pristine river. This happened to be August when the U.S. Drought Monitor had us in extreme drought. That meant that the river volume was as low as we've seen it. This river can't handle that kind of sediment, and yet developers will send that kind of sediment into a river. It's a sad fact of human impact that could be avoided. In this case, the state of Colorado had a talk with this particular developer. Something else that we have, I'm going to advance this by touching what? This button? Watch it when I start touching buttons. Not that one. Not bad for an old guy. This is snow storage. Just on the other side of that pile is St. Louis Creek. We call this storm water. When that pile melts, all that sediment that's in that snow is going to end up in St. Louis Creek. That's an avoidable human impact. This happens to be on private property. The town of Winter Park and Fraser haul their snow way away from the river where they store it. But still, we have this human impact, which falls under stormwater. Now, one thing the town of Winter Park or Fraser or any other town in Grand County doesn't do is stormwater control. Pretty much our streets flow directly into the river because the state of Colorado tells our towns if you're under 10,000 people in population, you don't have to do stormwater control. We're a headwaters community. What happens what human impacts we see here in the headwaters follow the river all the way down. There's no more important project for our communities to be doing than keeping sediment out of the river, doing stormwater control, and not having a human impact that's easily avoided. The towns that are required to do it treat that water before it goes into the river. It's not very difficult treatment. It costs money. We have grant possibilities. There's all kinds of ways if we would understand it as a problem and focus on it and try and solve it. So I guess the bottom line is, as headwaters communities, we need to be more sensitive with what we allow to get in the river. And whether it's required by law or not, we can voluntarily keep our rivers clean and send something downstream that's going to be a whole lot easier on the people downstream and on the river. So that's the development human impact on rivers, or human impacts from development. Now, Marissa's going to talk to you about agricultural impacts, which happen a little further down. That's the final impact in Grand County here, but a fairly strong one.
Alrighty, so I'm going to touch on some poor agricultural practices that happen. So as we can see, this picture is not from a local place. It's just kind of an image for your own imagination. Cattle overgraze the riparian plants, which destroys the filter for the river. They also trample the banks, destroying the undercut, which is the undercut bank, which is like a habitat for the trout. So a solution that seems kind of obvious: fence your cattle and your livestock away from the rivers, especially with their like manure getting in the waterways and things like that. And I feel like the biggest impact is what they eat. So here's like a picture, where we fenced away from livestock, just like keeping a good distance between the river and where the animals can be. So here, obviously most cattle in the US is grain fed. And so the statistic behind me, that an average of 600,000 gallons of water is used per acre for corn, which is pretty crazy. And you might be thinking, what relevance does it have to Greene County? The Thompson Bank project, the Colorado Big Thompson project. So like the big lakes around here, at one point were all used, and that water was all taken for agricultural use. Things like growing corn and maize and things like that, which don't belong in the West because they're very thirsty plants. Here's a little statistic. 70% of the soy grown in the US is not for human consumption. About 4.39 billion bushels of soy is grown. A bushel is 60 pounds-ish. A third of the water consumed goes to irrigate plants for not human consumption, or irrigate crops that are not for human consumption. And now the Colorado Big Thompson project, only about 30% of that water is now leaving for agricultural use. So in some way, wherever we are, there's ultimately an impact on rivers and somewhere. And one thing specifically that uses so much water is meat. The statistic on beef is that 1,800 to 2,000 gallons of water is needed for 1 pound of beef. Just like one thing to hold yourself accountable for. And then Kirk and I are gonna get onto a couple solutions after we've kind of addressed all the problems, which is the easiest thing to do, but river conservation is all about solutions. So as we've discussed in this presentation, many of the problems that our rivers face is the impact of human ingenuity. Consequently, many of the solutions can be human engineered. Good examples of this are the sediment collection basin that I showed earlier at Berthoud Pass, and the stream channeling that Kirk talked about before, which we'll go ahead and bring up in a second. I'm just gonna quickly change the picture for you.
Perfect.
So I'll bring Kirk up here to talk about collaboration.
So human-engineered problems, human-engineered solutions. This is a picture of an overgrazed area where the riparian zone has been destroyed due to poor ranching practices. This is the Colorado River Headwaters chapter partnering with Learning by Doing to plant willows to help reestablish the riparian. These willows will grow up to create a canopy that'll provide shade for other wetlands plants. They stabilize the stream banks by setting down roots very deep. Create great trout habitat because it gets undercut under the roots, but the ground doesn't cave in. And they also, we focus on harvesting willow stakes from willows that are really tall because we want these to grow up to provide shade for the river so that it can help cool the stream. Okay, I'm punching buttons again. Okay, so this project I talked about earlier, the Fraser Flats project, this was done through collaboration. Collaboration is one of the best possible solutions for solving our river health issues in Colorado. We have multiple interests using this water, multiple interests having an impact on our rivers. When you get those multiple interests together, then you can start problem solving. Finger pointing, there's no place for finger pointing in keeping our rivers healthy. So Learning by Doing, I mentioned, that's a collaboration between the two biggest water diverters out of Grand County, which is Denver Water and Northern. It's also Grand County government, the River District, Trout Unlimited, a couple I'm forgetting and we'll throw in later, Middle Park Water Conservancy. Did I mention Trout Unlimited? I can't throw them in enough. Anyway, when you get the environmentalists and the agricultural community and the municipalities together to solve water problems, things happen. This project happened because of that. There's a lot of projects in the future that will be happening because of the collaboration. It's one of the key tools we have in our toolbox for making our rivers healthier, for dealing with these impacts that we've been creating for centuries. Another excellent example of collaboration right here in Grand County is the Grand County Drought Preparedness Plan. Drought is the new norm. We have to be ready. We can't do this one knee-jerk. So we got the golf courses and the agricultural community and the municipalities and the water providers and the conservation organizations together. And we wrote a plan that will help identify what level of drought we're in and what steps we need to take with each level of drought. So we can, as a county, have an organized plan for dealing with a shortage of water and maybe being able to keep some of that water in the river by simply using less. A really good example would be agricultural water. A lot of ranchers will tell you it's use it or lose it, so I take my water whether I need it or not. In a drought year, that's not necessary. And the state engineers department will even tell you, you have to not use your water for several consecutive years to be on the abandonment water list. So during a drought, the Grand County Drought Preparedness Plan asks ranchers to use only what you need. They're not going to take it away from you if you don't use it all. But if you overwater your hay in a drought, you're hurting your neighbor, you're hurting the river. The drought plan really points out a lot of the solutions to how we use water when there's a shortage. Front Range cities also have drought management plans. And the fact that we have one here in Grand County gives us a voice down on the Front Range when our drought management plan says we're in a stage 1 drought because the governor has declared the entire state of Colorado in an extreme drought, and you haven't even kicked in your drought watch part of your plan yet. It gives us a voice in the water community. So that was another collaboration. It was a lot of water users in Grand County making that happen. So the bottom line is, on collaboration, is the health of the river hinges on the people who use that water, municipal, agricultural, and the environmental interest, to work together to guarantee a fair and equal distribution of Colorado's water. This is something we can do. It's a solution. It's something we are doing through organizations like Learning by Doing. And that's all I have on collaboration, but Marissa has quite a bit to talk about on conservation.
Alrighty, this work involves compromise from each water user, starting with conservation. With the population of Colorado rapidly growing, how we use our water becomes more important each day. Municipal and agricultural water users will need to improve on their efficiency. Front Range suburbs rely on mostly water diverted from West Slope rivers, while using over 50% of that for lawn watering in a high plains desert. The Colorado Big Thompson project was built to grow water-thirsty crops in the same desert. What we grow seems to be the low-hanging fruit in water conservation. Environmental interests will need to do more with less. Colorado water law were written into the state constitution and makes it possible to dewater up to 100% of our rivers. In 1973, the state started dedicating minimum flow rights to rivers, which has given the environment hope. The challenge for the conservation community is to work with these minimum flows, acquire water rights for the in-stream flows, and to work with water rights owners and lease water so that some flows may be maintained in our local streams. With the flows to work with, work can begin on the stream channels to match the stream flow and the size of the stream channel to create a healthy aquatic habitat. And then Kirk is going to talk about some legislation with us.
One other important aspect of coming up with solutions to the human impacts on the headwaters is through legislation. Water law was written while we were still a territory. It became part of the Constitution in 1876. It's not set in stone. Our legislature has already passed laws that tweak water law. You could never change it because it's a personal property right. I don't think we'd ever want to go there. But like Marissa mentioned, in 1973, the state gave itself the right to own minimum stream flows, and they filed on minimum stream flows in streams. And these 1973 is kind of a junior water right in Grand County, but there will be a day when that water right will guarantee some flow in the river. Other laws that the legislature's tweaked is our in-stream flows. They made it legal for water rights owners to keep their water in the river and have it count as a beneficial use during drought years. That's a huge change. As citizens, those legislators work for us. So we have the ability to influence what laws are introduced and what laws get passed. So being active and understanding legislation, and most organizations like Trout Unlimited have a lobbyist. They're very active in participating in legislation. We have several good conservation organizations in Colorado doing that, and they ask for help when it's time to raise our voice. we have a say in the state legislature, and we have a say locally. If we want stormwater, even though it's not required by law, we can talk to our town councils and ask them why a Headwaters community is letting their streets flow directly into rivers. Legislation is one of those solutions that every citizen has a chance to participate in. So it's one of the important solutions. And of course, the most important solution is education. Marissa will talk about that.
Education is the cornerstone of all conservation work. People won't change their habits until they have an understanding of why they must change. Reading to gain a better understanding is a good place to start. An author named Stephen Grace has an excellent writing style, which makes this education more entertaining. He has written a number of books about water. One is at the West called Damnation. One about Colorado water called The Great Divide, which is available downstairs. And then one about the water here in Grand County called Oil and Water. The Headwaters Center and River Journey are great examples of the work being done to help change people's perceptions of where they live and what their environmental impacts are on the choices they make. Education outreach is a main focus of conservation organizations with a focus on educating youth who will be inheriting the issues that this generation could not resolve. With 80% of our state's population living on the east side of the Continental Divide, there's an enormous opportunity to educate landowners on the solutions to a finite water supply being shared by multiple water interests and to connect their water use with the West Slope rivers. The Headwaters River Journey is a good first step in this very long journey. So finishing on that note, Kirk and I are going to take a couple questions if anybody has any. We can check the Zoom chat here as well. Okay, no questions on there. Kirk, do you have anything you want to add?
I only want to add that it's so important that we don't just understand what the problems are, it's that we understand that there are solutions and solutions that we can participate in. And with that, if there's no questions, I want to thank the people in person for showing up. That is very kind. And anyone who participated on Zoom, thank you.